Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Ala, and I'm joined by Chris. We are both teachers at LSAT Demon, which you can find at lsatdemon.com. This is the second episode in our RC series, and we're really excited about it. We love talking to you guys. We love trying to put content out there about RC because we both love RC, and we want to teach you how to fall in love with it. And we think it makes sense. We think it's learnable, and we think it's fun. Today, we wanted to answer a question that we get, I think, weekly in our respective classes, which is, how do I get faster at RC? I get this question a lot. I know Chris gets this question a lot. And I think the focus of this episode is try to get y'all to look past the question and maybe the motivation behind the question, and to teach y'all that this is a place where you might need to stop thinking about the time, where you may need to look past that and think, what can I get out of this passage? What can I get out of this section that isn't about the time, that isn't about other stuff? It's not about the noise. So Chris, do you get this question a lot? And maybe you can talk a little bit about like what this means for you.
Yeah, I probably get this question multiple times a week, pre-class when the students are filtering it, and then usually at the end of class as well. It's just something that students are concerned by, and it makes sense. You're on a time section, you're reading a lot of things, and you have to read a lot of things times 4. The worry is understandable, but I think Ala, like we've talked about, and like we hope to draw out in this episode, the focus on speed and the focus on time inhibits our ultimate goal, which is accuracy and getting a high score in our RC sections. If you focus on reading as quick as you can, what you're actually going to do is create so much more work for yourself in that passage and in all the questions that you'll have to navigate.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think and we understand the pull towards thinking about time. We totally get it. We've both been there before, and we've thought about time too much, which is why we're here telling you to not think about time. And it's for a couple of different reasons. One, because time is subjective. And when I say that, I'm not trying to open a philosophical discussion about time being subjective, although I would love to have that discussion. What I'm saying—
Next podcast.
All right. What I'm saying there is, when I say time is subjective, what I'm saying is, think about how you experience time. Like sometimes if you're like waiting in an airport, it might feel like 2 hours. It's like 2 days. If you're having a really good conversation with a friend, it would just zip by, right? So the seconds that are going by, there's never going to be a question that's like, how much time is left on this section? You're never going to get a point from that. And I know you know that, right? Like students know that. My students are really smart. All of you guys are really smart. You are capable. You can do this. But when you treat time as this sort of like rigid thing that's in front of you, it's not assisting you in this process. Another reason why time's not great is that it's irrelevant. It's not there to help you. It's not your friend in any way. It's essentially just something that's there that is going to be monitoring in the background and sort of like the back burner. But your goal should be the sentence in front of you, the question in front of you, to focus, to sort of like fall into that interest of what they're talking to you about.
Yeah. If the LSAT gave bonus points for all the minutes you have left on your section, I'm sure there'd be a trade-off in accuracy versus speed on this one. You know, like maybe I'll miss 6 questions, but I'm going to finish 10 early. That'll give me bonus points to win. Unfortunately, that's not actually what the LSAT does with reading comprehension. And we know when students are rushed, when I rush myself on passages, I don't answer with perfect accuracy. And that's where I lose points. And so I return often to this concept of you cannot be accurate. It's impossible to be perfectly accurate if you're trying for speed, if that's your goal.
And this is funny. This is probably relevant to students just because like, what happens if somebody that's like, you know, both of us have done well on the LSAT. What happens when you guys try to like speed up? Like, what does that look like? And I kid you not, I try to, you know, look at questions for the Ask button or for my classes. And sometimes I'm lazy about it. Sometimes I'm a bad student about it. And I just like try to like be like, oh no, it's fine. I got it. Let me just like go through. And I get them wrong because I'm not paying attention, because I'm not being present, because I'm thinking about like, I got to start class in like a certain number of minutes. Let me just zip through these. It never works. It doesn't matter who you are. You're going to miss the question. because thinking about time is helping nobody, including people that, you may have done well in the LSAT.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And there's a method and a process to this.
Yeah.
And in this episode, we're going to talk about that process of how you
Yes.
really create understanding. And in creating that understanding, it's building a skill. And that's how students need to view the LSAT overall. It's a skill building process that takes time, rewards effort. But when we're doing any skill building thing, whether it's a sport, an instrument, any type of hobby, art, you have to practice that skill in the way that you'd like that skill to be improved. So, for example, if I wanted to learn how to paint and become an excellent oil painter, or maybe even just acrylic, Bob Ross is fine. That's okay. You did great
I
work.
love Bob.
If I wanted to learn how to do that, and I told you what I'm going to do to learn how to paint like Bob Ross is just paint these paintings as quick as I can, get a lot of them done, paint 6, 7 things a day, just really knock them out. And in doing that, I'll see a lot of paintings and I'll become a good painter. You would probably tell me I'm insane.
Well, I think you're insane already, Chris. So,
That's fair. And so I feel the same way when students tell me that what they're focused on is time, because what they're not doing is building that understanding skill.
Yeah.
And so when I talk to students, I don't talk about time, I talk about understanding. And that even if achieving understanding in a passage takes you the full 30 minutes before we look at questions, that is still good because in that process, you're building that understanding skill. And that understanding skill is what we need for high accuracy and success in these RC practices. So students need to practice the way they want to play. You want to play with perfect accuracy, you have to practice that way too. And the only way you improve that skill is by taking your time.
I totally agree with that. And your discussion is reminding me of something else that, I've gotten this question in class too, of like, how do I not think about the time, right? If you get past the, how do I get faster at RC? The next question is, how do I not think about the time? And one of the things that comes up for me is if you're somebody that's experiencing anxiety or nervousness about the LSAT, you are in good company because that's everybody, right? If you're feeling those, I can guarantee it, you're going to feel them more on test day, on the official test day, right? At the Demon, we want you to treat the official test day like any practice test. But you're not crazy. You're living in reality and you know that it's an official test. And you're going to feel slightly more of those nerves. You're going to feel like, there's going to be Proctor U there. There's going to be things going on. And you're going to feel that. And unless, like Chris is saying, you practice like you play, you practice ignoring the clock in your practice sections and your practice tests, there is no way in hell you're going to be able to do it on official test day. You're going to keep thinking, like, how much time do I have left? And every second that you spend thinking about how much time you have left is time you're not spending getting questions right. So I also house, this sort of, how do I not think about the time under what Chris is saying, which is practice like you play. Think about the test. Think about the sentence in front of you. Take that information and be curious. Bake some curiosity, right? All of that is you engaging with the test and being present. And that, temptation to look at the time, it goes away. It really does. It goes away the more you spend time not thinking about the time. And then when you get to the official test, it may be a little bit harder, but not all that different because you've been doing it the way you want to actually do it on the official test.
I love that. And I'll be honest, Ella, I was still nervous on every LSAT I took. I took it 4 times. I was nervous each and every time.
Yep.
Yeah. And what I fell back on when I was nervous was the method and deliberate approach that I had practiced 1,000 times on these sections. When we have a fire alarm or a real emergency scenario, our brain's in panic mode, what do we fall back on? The fire drill that we've done 1 billion times in this elementary school to exit the building on the predetermined path. Or if you're a musician right before a massive concert, there's no way that musician would honestly say, oh, I just thought back and remembered my piano at home and it felt just like that piano at home. No, they're going to be nervous. It's a big event. They know that. But what they can fall back on is the fact that they've played that song 1,000 times. They can fall back into method and routine. And so that method and routine is what we need to practice. So when things get nervous, when we lose our place, things seem a little scary, we have that recipe we can follow.
Exactly. And I love that you're saying that in analogy to a fire drill because it sometimes like you can feel your chest, like you can feel your heart in your chest, right? Like you feel the heart palpitations and you feel like the environment and you start sweating. I definitely sweat through like every single pair of the clothes I wore on the official test, right? You feel the reality of the situation that you're facing. And the goal here isn't to run away from that feeling or to like try to turn it off completely. In a way, I think it's one of those things that keeps you like focused. I think a little bit of nervousness, a little bit of anxiety can actually help you because you know that there are stakes involved here. And that's okay. We don't want you to turn that off. But we don't want you to associate those nerves with things that are unhelpful like time. We want you to associate that with, hey, what is this sentence saying exactly? What do they mean when they say this phrase, right? We want you to make those healthy associations in a way that pulls you forward into progress on a section rather than things that are unhelpful like the time.
Yeah. And so today we're going to talk about kind of that process and that method a bit with the ultimate hope that when you practice that method, you perfect that method, your speed will follow after the accuracy in the section and that understanding is complete. So maybe we should actually just take a little bit of a step back. Ala, what is an RC passage? What's it having us do?
An RC passage, I'm actually thinking about, sort of how I first took like my very first RC passage or RC section. And it is very straightforward, right? It's a couple of paragraphs that are giving you some information about something. That's it, right? There's nothing fancy going on. All they're doing is they're presenting some information to you in some kind of order. Sometimes it's an argument. They want to convince you of something. Sometimes it's multiple arguments, right? There's like people on this side that say this, and there's people on that side that say that. Sometimes it's like a reporter style, right? They're just explaining to you about some phenomenon that's going on. They love the word phenomenon. Some phenomenon that's going on, and they want you to know that this is important about it or that's important about it. Sometimes it's history, music, right? These are all topics that they cover, but very generally, they're giving you some information that's connected in some way, and they're going to ask you some questions about how it's connected, why they're talking to you at all, right? And that's an RC passage. Would you add anything else?
Yeah, I would just add, I think I must have been just lucky in life that my three guiding passions are medieval artwork, arcane legal theory, and universal metaphysics. With those, all of these are so fascinating. I kid, obviously. These are topics that I don't think anyone prior to taking the LSAT probably would have spent any time reading. You might look out, and one of those was your major or an interest. But at the end of the day, our job is the same, regardless of these topics. You are not going to find every single one of them in your wheelhouse and absolutely riveting from beginning to end. But I can read an instruction booklet and still understand it because I need to operate my device, whether I'm interested in the writing or I find it enjoyable or not. And at the end of the day, that understanding is what we're asked to do in every single one of these RC passages, regardless of topic.
Yeah. And I love that you said that, Chris, because I'm actually trying to read this book right now. It's called One Hell of a Ride. I'm trying to think about law school and like maybe some things I should think about when it comes to law school, which
law school,
we'll both...
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which hopefully we'll both be starting this fall and, at maybe a full ride or close to a full ride. That would be awesome. So I've been trying to think about my 1L year. And one of the things that the professor that wrote the book talks about is sort of like that you may go in thinking that like con law is like the thing that you're going to love. And then you may come out of it going like, this is terrible. And what I'm saying when I point that out is that you're going to have to read some things that you don't like in law school. And I want you to approach an RC section the same way. There's going to be passages in there where you're like, a science passage, or for me, it was art passages. I could not stand those. But your job as a lawyer, your job as a 1L student is going to be to get through it, to understand it, to figure it out and see how it fits together and put some of those sort of like initial reactions of maybe even repulsion aside to be able to be like, okay, this is what they think is important. This is what I care about. This is how it's connected.
Yeah. And when we say understanding, I want to be clear, what we're not talking about is memorization or regurgitation of the passage. And
Yep.
unfortunately, I am a proud product of American public schooling. Those are the skills that were rewarded in school, is
Yeah.
skimming, regurgitating what it said, memorizing a fact or a date, closing the test, moving on. Those
Hmm.
are the behaviors that, if that's still how you read, get you into infinite amounts of trouble in RC. Because our job is to understand purpose, argument, and direction in these passages. And unlocking those as early as possible with the smallest amount of clues we can get in a passage is what enables us to organize and move through the passage with purpose and direction. Once we figure out why that author is shouting at us with this weird arcane topic with artwork or travel guides or language and linguistics, as soon as we figure out what they actually want to get across, the rest of the passage can become so smooth reading and organizing it from there.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it really is about understanding. It really is about, it's like, think about yourself, like, let's say you have to pee really bad, like really, really bad. And you're like on the way to the bathroom and someone stops you and says, "Hey, I want to tell you about wormholes." Like, well, please,
Happens to me
can you,
every day. Yeah, I get it. Yeah. Preaching to the choir.
right? Can you like, so your goal is, you need to go to the bathroom. So it's not, I'm not talking about speed here. What I'm talking about is, can you get to the point? What's really important here? So let's say you've read a passage and you have to go to the bathroom. In one sentence, can we say, what do they want here? Like, what do you want from me? I have to pee. What do you want from me?
Yeah. And sometimes our first hints of this in a passage are single words or
Hmm.
adverbs, or it's something like clearly or
Yeah.
understandably or
Yeah.
rightly so. And if you're
Hmm.
reading for speed, those are so easy to skim over. They don't seem like important words individually, but those placed in a specific sentence tells us everything we need about what the author thinks and why we're here. Once we can tell what the author thinks and why we're here, the rest of the passage, it like almost fades away to mist. It's not obscure anymore. Everything can make sense. We can figure out what these paragraphs and sentences are doing.
Yeah, I agree with that, Chris. And I think, especially in the first couple of passages, those words can be super important. They're the words that give you an indication of what the author thinks or what the author's opinion is. Because, like we mentioned in our last episode, they have to give you the information or they can't ask you questions about it. And also note that usually in the third and fourth passage, some of that information, they add more jargon. They jumble up some sentences. They give you the sentences out of order. They'll say then and then if instead of if and then, right? Like they'll do that to you. And they're not trying to mess with you there. They're trying to see how much you can wade through in order to understand their point. So sometimes it'll say clearly and understandably and rightly so, but other times it won't do that and it'll include that in sentences as it goes through. And if you're not reading and linking those connections they're making together, you're just not setting yourself up for success.
Absolutely. And once we get to that understanding, it enables us to do things that are really cool in the passage. And my favorite thing to do with these passages is actually predict, okay, the author thinks this, or the author is arguing this. What do
Mm-hmm.
they have to say next to draw this point
Yeah.
out? Or what do they have to disprove if this is their thought? And so having that understanding of their argument, their purpose, allows me to see, okay, this is the direction this whole boat is moving. This is the
Yeah.
port I have to stop in. This is the place I
Yeah.
have to end. These are the things I have to sightsee on the way. Gives me direction through the whole passage. And that means once I encounter those things in the passage, they're not just random facts that I don't know what to do with. They're road marks on the map that I knew we had to go.
I like that. That's awesome. I would even be curious, Chris, do you feel like calmer when you predict, or do you feel like calmer when you give yourself that um almost that roadmap that you're talking about?
I do. And in my process of reading RC Alla, when I begin a passage, I am very slow, hesitant, deliberate in my first
Yeah.
couple paragraphs. And that's while I'm still trying to draw out that purpose. I'm still
Hmm.
holding all these sentences equally. I'm trying to figure out why we're here. I'm waiting for an author or POV to weigh in. So I step really carefully. I walk slowly. As
Yeah.
soon as I'm able to uncover that purpose, it's like a wash of relief. I'm like, okay, now I can breathe and I know what I actually have to hold on to here because it's
Yeah.
not every single fact in the passage. What I have to do is be able to show where these facts are pointing and what facts support what in the passage.
Hmm. I like that. And I think I feel the same way about predicting too. It's sort of, I try to keep myself hungry essentially. Like from the beginning of the passage, I'm like, okay, you told me this and I understand. Like, let's say the first sentence doesn't have an indication of the main point. Maybe it's just context, right? I take that sentence in and I start like sending little like feelers out. And I'm like, okay, it could go here, it could go there. And the idea isn't to overwhelm myself with the possibilities, but as I send out those possibilities in my brain where I'm like, okay, they could talk about this being bad, that being good, right? As I send that all out, I'm essentially giving myself an opportunity to be wrong, right? Because the main point of a passage or the author talking to me saying like, I think this proposal is terrible, right? When that's one of my options and I'm like, okay, I can forget everything else. It's now about this. And the act of predicting, it's not to be perfect. And we certainly mean this for the questions too. When we say predict, we're essentially saying engage with strategy. Add some nuance to how you're engaging. It's not just engaging, it's like, where might they go next is a specific question. And we want you guys to be like, okay, these are the 3, 4 places I think it could go. And that exercise in your brain is you creating a connection with the passage. It's how a brain works, it's those neural pathways. And when you entertain the possibility of that and you stay hungry for it and you actually get an answer, you're like, wow, that felt really good. I figured out what this passage is really about.
Many students, I think, still read RC passages from the perspective of what? What is this
Mm,
sentence? What is this word? What is it saying? Which is
yeah.
important. That's a key part of the process. Has to happen. What we need to also add into that process is the why. Why this sentence? Why here? Why now? And that process where you're describing of predicting, guessing, sending out feelers, those are all why questions. Those aren't what questions. And so I often use this analogy of like holding a pile of Legos in my hand. And all the Legos are the sentences from the passage. So if I'm looking at this pile of Legos, really overwhelming. I don't know what they're supposed to be. And so each of these Legos in my hand looks equal and confusing, and holding on to them all is really, really difficult. But if instead I pick up each Lego one at a time, not only say red Lego, blue Lego, yellow Lego, but I say, why this one and why this one right here? I'm starting to build a picture. And so as soon as I can figure out, oh my God, this is the Avengers headquarters. And this is what I need to build to construct the Avengers headquarters. And so I know here I need to have the helicopter landing pad. This is what
Mm-hmm.
it has to be. So as soon as I pick up a piece and I'm like, oh, perfect, helicopter landing pad piece. That makes
Right.
sense based on this framework that I'm building in my head. But if all I'm doing is just picking up those pieces, trying to describe each piece one at a time, I'm blind to the bigger picture of this shape. And so the LSAT in reading comprehension rewards students who can organize their Legos and figure out what picture they're building. The nice thing is, in all of these passages, the author tells us what picture we're building. We really don't have to guess. We just have to find it, which sometimes is more obscure than others, but it's always in there.
I love that. I love that analogy. I'm actually thinking of the kinds that I use in my classes. One that comes to mind is like, think about yourself at some sort of like government agency. I'm thinking like a DMV, right? And you have to get a license or you have to get something done, and it's going to be annoying. It's a long process, right? Maybe it's a passage that you don't like to read, essentially, right? You're at the DMV, you don't want to be there, and you have forms with you. You've got like your driver's license, your passport, like residence forms. I swear to God, the DMV asks for like 8,000 different things. You've got all of them with you, and they're in no particular order. They're not in an order that you may give them to the clerk. They're not in any sort of order of importance. You have no system at all for how to answer the questions that the clerk's going to ask you. Be like, hey, can I have like this like I-97 form? Like, no, I don't know where that is. I have to go look for it. And then you're wasting their time. You're wasting everything. And you're also stressed out because you're like, I got to get into work or I have to do that. Right. Think about how your life would be answering the clerk's questions if you had an accordion folder with you, right? Things that are labeled, things that are maybe in a certain order of relevance to whatever process you're going through. Then you're in control. You are the one, like Chris is saying in the Lego analogy, that have organized this into something that makes sense. This process has meaning now, and this process is built in order to answer the questions, right? They're giving you the information in a weird order, or they're giving you information with varying levels of importance too, right? Like some sentences are far more important than other sentences. The sentence that has a main point is going to be crucial, but a sentence that has some detail about some example they give, you should read it and you should understand it, but it's not as important as the main point sentence. So now, that might be at the back of my accordion folder where I'm like, yeah, this is miscellaneous, or this is something that doesn't, isn't really integral to the entire story, but I've got this construction and now I've got a method. I've got a way to fight in the questions where I know, oh, you wanted that information that's connected to this position that the author held. And in that way, you are doing lawyering work. You're doing work to understand, you're doing work to interact, and you're doing work to make the facts make sense. It's like, this is sort of what journalists do too. They get a lot of information, certain incidents happen out in the world and they get reports of them. But a journalist's job is to put that into context. What does it mean for this bill to pass? Right? So all of these are ways in which smart people, organize information so that it's useful for themselves and for others. And that's what essentially an RC passage is testing you is, hey, can you take by the way, it's only 15 to 17 sentences. I was in class when Ben told me that. And this was like when I was a Demon student, and Ben was like, it's 15 to 17 sentences. And I think I had to take a day to myself because I was like, wow, that's so short. It's just 15 to 16 sentences. So you're not having to understand a bill or understand case law or read Nietzsche, which I would never ask anyone to do, right? It's none of those things. You're just being asked to understand about 15 to 16 sentences. We're not saying it's easy. We're saying it's straightforward. We're saying it does fit together if you give yourself the time and the patience to get there.
And here's the rub. When we read those 15 to 17 sentences from the framework of what, every one of them looks equally important, and all of them are hard to distinguish from the others. They're all sentences that are giving information. Yeah. When we read from this perspective of why, we clearly figure out sentences that are in line with the why, the purpose, quickly fold, organize underneath that, or we can easily identify sentences that are outliers, that are concessions, that are things that are different than that main point. And believe me, those are prime LSAT question material. Whenever we have a theme, a guiding argument, a main point, anything that seems a little misfit or doesn't quite go there, or a concession, I promise more often than not, they're going to build that into a question somewhere. So this process of understanding and asking why enables us to read with higher accuracy, more certainty, and that helps us on questions. Alla, when you've achieved a high level of understanding on a passage, you've taken your time, you've done the work, talk about the experience of answering questions on these sections.
It kind of feels like I can see the answers shining out at me. I was in class when I was, probably in the 150s or the 160s. And I remember Nathan saying this in a class of sort of yeah, you'll kind of feel like you can see the answer shining out at you. It's almost like, we've got the little Demon platform where it'll highlight it for you. It's almost like that's what it'll look like. And I was like, Nathan's crazy. There's no way it's going to feel like that. I'm very happy to be wrong about that. It definitely feels like that because, like Chris is saying, you've given yourself the opportunity to build the Lego, the Lego blocks into what they're supposed to look like. And when you know what it looks like, anything that betrays the story you've built is going to stick out like a sore thumb. And those 4 wrong answers on any given question, they're going to look terrible. And the more distance you can put between a correct answer and the 4 wrong answers, the better you're getting at the LSAT. You're seeing that, wow, this makes sense. And this makes sense this much. The wrong answers are so wrong because they don't fit with the story I've built, because I'm the expert. I'm the person that's handling this. What do you think? Like, how do you go through the questions? How do you feel like you feel given that you've built the story in your head?
Yeah, well, this is going to show my age and make me look as old as I am, which is fine. I'm proud of it. I'm happy to be my age. I reference all the time in class that scene from the first Matrix movie when Neo's in the hallway of the hotel at the very end, and he has
Yeah.
that second when he can perceive the Matrix. He sees all the code running, the bullets are flying at him, and he like puts his hand up,
Yeah.
and like they all fall to the ground. When I
Yeah.
was a beginning student, I thought these RC questions were all loaded bullets coming my way. They were tricky, they were dangerous, they were traps. It was like navigating a landmine. They were so difficult, and I felt like a single word could trick me, make it wrong, and I wouldn't be able to perceive it. And I went in with such a high level of stress. It was like, okay, we're going to battle. These questions are coming. I got to beat some ass. Now, when I look at the questions, I'm like, I know exactly what I'm looking for. These are
Mm-hmm.
so simple. It's like the curtain's been pulled back. I see the great and powerful Oz. Like it's really not that scary because I have that understanding going in. And the questions are not threatening. It's really just a matter of search and find. It's similar to LG, like we talked about last episode. When we've got that world built, I'm not scared of the wrong answer choices because I
Yeah.
know as soon as I see the right answer choice, it'll stick out to me. But for that to happen, we had to have created understanding in the passage of the purpose. So for me, when I enter these questions, the question right away after reading it tells me whether I have the understanding I need or not. Because I should be
Yeah.
able to articulate as soon as I read the question what I need that answer choice to be. Does that always match the content 100%? Definitely not. I'd say rarely do I actually match the word for word content verbatim of the
Yeah.
answer choice, but I
Yeah.
can tell exactly what I need the answer choice to do. It needs to support the author's argument by XYZ, or it needs to disagree with the author's argument because of this, or it has to say this specific factor. Those are things I know. And that's like my shopping list going in. So anything that's not on that shopping list, I don't buy.
I love that you said that. I think that makes complete sense to me. And we're not surprised that students don't like RC. That's why we're doing this. The reason why is because if you're not doing it the way Chris is talking about it, it's really uncomfortable. It's really scary. It's really uncomfortable. And it feels very overwhelming. And we're essentially saying it's not your fault that it feels overwhelming and uncomfortable because you may have been approaching it as the points are in the questions. Let me go over there. And that's tempting. And we understand that just like it's tempting to think about the time, it's very tempting to move on from the passage into where the points are. But the points and the map to getting to the points are actually in the passage, right? And so forgive yourself if you're somebody that's been, maybe spending 2, 3 minutes on the passage and then 6, 7, 8 minutes in the questions. We almost want you to flip those numbers. We want you to give yourself as much time as possible to understand the passage and then go into the questions. Because if you're not doing that, you're kind of setting yourself up to fail. You're kind of saying like, I kind of get what this passage is saying, but I don't get how the story fits together, but I'll be fine because the questions will help me out. And I remember, as Chris was talking about how the questions or the answer choices used to feel before we started reading for comprehension. And I sort of got like a flashback of sort of, I'd find an answer I liked, and then I'd be afraid as I went to read B or C, be like, oh, I hope I don't also like this. And I'd be like, no, I also like this. Right. And then it becomes this sort of like meltdown where I'm like, oh God, I like 3 of these answers. And I don't know if this word makes this wrong. We don't want you to mess with any of that. We want you to become the experts. And then we want you to feel the power that comes from, I understand. I know what the passage did say. And I also know what the passage did not say. And when you combine all of that together and you're like, I get the narrative here, I get what the author cares about, then you're the person that's going to move through it like Neo.
And if you don't feel like Neo at the end of the Matrix yet, don't feel bad. It took
Yeah.
Neo about 2 hours of screen time dressed as a late 90s cyber goth and dying and coming back to get to that point, which
Spoiler
is okay.
alert.
Oh, yes, sorry. The LSAT isn't that hard. Okay. It's
Yeah.
simpler than that. And the way that we get there is by practicing that understanding skill that we've been talking about. And Ala made a fantastic point. If we're still thinking about time, we're missing the picture. But when we see students lose time most often, it's because the question forces them to reread large sections of the passage or bounce back and forth over and over and over again from question to passage, from question to passage. When I go through these RC passages, it's really a one-way train. I read, I understand, then I go through the questions. And if I have to go back, it's a context question. Often it's a purpose or use question, or there's a specific micro fact that I want to make sure I've got aligned in the right way. But because I read with understanding, I know right where it's at. I can find it. So it's more going through my data bank than rereading the passage.
I try to remind students every time I go back to a passage in one of my classes, I'm like, hey, I'm going back because this is a quote or this is something specific, but I'm not going back to reread or re-understand. I'm skimming in the passage to remind myself where I am in my own narrative that I've constructed. We don't like double work at the Demon. We don't want you to hold rules in your head in games. We don't want you to have to like read the question and come. We don't want you to do we want to make your life easy. We want to make it straightforward. And the straightforward way to do this is to give yourself a shot to understand. And when you have to go back, it's sort of like, oh, I don't remember exactly where that was. You do a quick check and then you come back to give yourself that like double check insurance rather than let me go and understand this question for the first time.
Yeah. And I think one of the tough parts when we're talking about a skill building process in RC is I've often found students who don't really know how to review, or they don't find a good way to continue getting value out of an RC passage that they might have done before. So what I often tell students is if you did an RC passage, you sped through it or didn't make the understanding you need, and your results weren't so good in the questions, I've been there, don't worry. The most useful exercise that I've found is reconstructing your process going backwards through the passage. By the end of the question, seeing what you got wrong, you should have gotten to a point of understanding of, oh, this is the thing I missed. This is the author's opinion that I didn't quite have right or I didn't pick up on. Go back through the passage and see what's the earliest possible point that I might have gotten a hint of that one. Where's the indicator that I didn't quite pick up? Where's the conclusory statement? Where's the opinion? Where's the adverb or flavor text I might have missed? Because what students who excel at RC are able to do is pick out that argument, pick out that purpose at the first available opportunity. In doing so, like we've been talking about, that shows us what Legos the passage is going to build, what we have to do with the rest of them. It makes the process smaller, easier, more discrete from there. So use that missed understanding or process through the passage as an opportunity to look at yourself and the way that we can grow, we can change, and add to that skill set by saying, aha, at that point in the first paragraph, I was reading too fast. Or when I read this sentence, I was still stuck on 2 sentences ago, trying to figure out what it meant. So I missed that hint here. If I would have had that hint, paragraph 3 would have made a lot more sense.
I like that you said that about reviewing RC, because I think review is one of those places that I find that students and myself sort of can adopt a growth mindset. We can say, hey, we don't get everything here. We don't understand everything about the LSAT. Let's make room to see where we can grow. And one of the things I think for RC that can help is that RC tends to feel mystifying to students, right? It feels ethereal. One of the ways you can build trust in RC is to go find the answer, the correct answer in the passage. And I used to do this, especially if I wasn't sure if I got a question wrong, but also if I wasn't sure about a question. Like, okay, this is the right answer and I picked this one, but I didn't know why I picked it. And then I would go back and be like, oh, it's because of this part of the argument. Now, part of the exercise is just reviewing the question of being like, okay, was this, let's say this was an analogy question where you had to think about what the passage said, do a little bit of thinking, and then apply it to an analogy and the answer choices, right? That's beyond just comprehending the passage. So if it's a question like that, you may have made a mistake in doing the translating from what the passage did to the analogy in the question. But more often than not, students find themselves in positions where they're like, but I don't think the passage went there, or I forgot this part of the story, which is, I think, what Chris is talking about. And when you give yourself an opportunity to go and find that in the passage, what you're doing is reaffirming that the test makes sense. That's one of the things that I struggled with a lot, and I see students struggling with it all the time, is they think there's an element of they're messing with us, or there's an element of like genius or something going on that makes, teachers at the Demon get questions right, but not the student. Like, that's not at all what's happening. We were exactly where you guys are, right? Our diagnostics were normal. We were just people that were trying to go to law school, and we're like, okay, we took this test, here we are. Right? We don't have any element of magic going on here. All we're doing is reading and understanding. And when you review, try to give yourself an opportunity, especially if you were like, this question makes no sense. If you're feeling that like thought come up, and that's totally fine, give yourself the opportunity to go find the evidence in the passage so that your brain can be like, oh, okay, I do need to invest time in the passage. I know that this makes sense. And you're not fighting that feeling anymore when you're going through the section, because that can be half the battle sometimes.
Yes. And when we review, we're not only reviewing the passage, the question, the high quality Demon explanation that Ala and I worked to write often in RC passages. We're also reviewing ourselves and our process and what led us there. So I'm going to use a sports analogy. If it doesn't connect, that's fine. Next episode, I can find a new one. If you're a batter in the box, bottom of the ninth, game on the line, and you swing at a ball and miss, we lose. Well, you could review the explanation that says, oh, that was a fastball high and away, shouldn't have swung at it. At some level, that's useful, right? But to avoid it next time, what we have to figure out is, what was it in myself that made me want to swing at that one? What decisions led me to be in that place, and what decisions from there led me to make that choice at that time? When we review RC, we have to do the same thing. We don't just want to pop open the explanation and see what the right answer is. We want to see, what was it in our process that led us to miss that answer and to select one that was wrong? What was the understanding we didn't create? And that's how growth happens. That's how skill building happens. And that's a process that takes intention and time.
I agree. That's a good place to think about time, is to think about giving yourself time to get good at the LSAT over the weeks and months. And for me, it was years. Give yourself the time to understand how this all fits together, because it's not going to be something that you accomplish overnight. And I hope you wouldn't want to either. I feel like there's a little bit of a kick that comes from getting good at something over a really long time. And then the high of like doing well on it, well down the line. I guess I'm a little bit of a freak when it comes to that. But what I'm trying to say is that the priorities that you have as you study, right? The priorities that you have during the section and the priorities that you have as you review, sometimes those are jumbled. And I totally agree with Chris. You have to be honest with yourself. Are you putting the LSAT first? Is RC your worst section? And are you listening to this podcast because you want to get better? If so, kudos to you, because you're working on the things that you hate.
Yeah. And, RC is a process. And I've got to be honest, I still feel like teaching these classes, working with students at the Demon, I'm still getting better at RC. My skill set is still growing at RC. Do you feel the same, Ala?
Oh, I totally feel the same way. And I think my students teach me stuff all the time. They teach me how to be like patient and teach me how to think about people with different needs that I may not have considered, right? I learn a lot from my students, and I'm deeply grateful to them when they take a minute to be like, oh, I don't get this, and this is why. And then I'm like, oh, I never considered that. Right? They'll stop me and I'll read a sentence one way. They're like, what if we read it this way? I was like, whoa, right? And that nuance that comes from paying attention and digging in, that makes me a better teacher. Honestly, I think that makes me a better communicator, a better friend to people, because now I'm like, okay, there is nuance in these things. There's more out there. There are multiple realities that I'm not considering and that I'm not thinking about when it comes to RC, or honestly any section of the LSAT.
I would agree, Ala. And just looking at this process of reading comprehension, looking at ourselves as objects, reconstructing our process in reading these, were there any passages you had particular trouble with, you felt like, or took you a longer time to adjust to?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, because the premise of it is that everyone's different, right? There are students I have that are like, I hate science passages. And in the same class, like within seconds, someone will be like, I love science passages. They're clear, they make sense to me. They're not trying to trick me, right? And that's another reason why time is a stupid thing to think about. We're not calling you stupid. Time is not a helpful thing to think about because it puts you in a position to have to follow some rule about how many minutes this passage should take you, right? I mean, for me, Chris, it was the art passages that I struggled with, and those did take me longer. But imagine if it was like, let's say those took me 12 minutes to do, and other passages took me closer to 8. Imagine if I had to force myself to give myself like 8 minutes on the art passages, which just genuinely took me longer to do. I wouldn't have called myself stupid for that. It's just what I needed. And I think being open, and that's why I think Chris is like, look at yourself, be honest with yourself is so important, because then you're giving yourself the ability to be like, okay, science passages are not my thing. They're going to take me a little bit longer. They're going to require more from me, and that's okay.
My experience couldn't be any more different. Loved arts and humanities. Hated
No.
with a passion the science passages. I don't think I took a science course since high school, to be honest. And for me, that was a while ago. So science coming back in RC was like a nightmare. And I would psych myself out of these passages. I would see the topic and I'd go, oh shit. And by then, I'd kind of already started a deficit. That's
Yeah.
like beginning the sports ball game down 10. Don't like that. I want to be 0-0 when we do kickoff. And here's where I realized I was struggling. When I had a passage that I would psych myself out in, that I would be more nervous, I would feel like I wasn't going to understand, it pushed me to thinking more and more about what. So I would read a
Mm.
fact, a mechanism, a scientific principle, a term I'd never read before about microbiomes or the multiverse. And I would like stay in this what world. Like, what the hell is that? What are they talking about? And how does it work? What
Yeah.
I adopted later is not diving further in, but actually stepping back and saying,
Mm.
okay, there's a what there, but really why? Why is that fact being here? Why is that mechanism being described? Why is that scientific principle here in this paragraph? Oh, it's to disprove this other one, or it's to show why the author believes this one. So if a question really asks me to get into the nitty gritty about how the universe could have formed with nuclear force being as weak as it was, I know where to look. I've got that here. What I'm going
Hmm.
to care about here is the why. This is why the author disbelieves this majority opinion about scientific theory. Got it, filed away, organized, found the direction. I can move on.
That's awesome. And I really like that you're talking about it being stepping away. And I love also that you're talking about it pulling into the what. And I think that I definitely found myself, it's like I would hold on to like, this sort of particular literary movement that this author belongs to. And I'd be like, this is going to help me answer a question. And more often than not, that's just noise. That's the context in which they're telling you why something's important. Particularly, I think for science passages, it's okay if you don't know how a wormhole works. They're probably not even going to try to explain it to you all that much. They give you those details so that maybe there's context, so that it does piece together, but they're not asking you to become an expert on those individual things. They're asking if you can be an expert on, to the extent of the information they gave you, can you understand what they're saying? Can you follow along? And can you, like Ben and Nathan say about being a lawyer, can you be a professional student? Can you learn from the context of the situation and be like, okay, this is all I have, but this is the narrative that's being constructed here, and I understand what's important.
So for
Do you think that
students,
fits?
no, I think it absolutely does. And for me, that putting my old student hat on, that connects with me when I was a student, and it seems to check out, with RC and what our process is. And so for any students out there concerned about speed, timing these sections, how do we add more passages? We absolutely understand. I have been there as a student. Allah has been there as a student. We want to be clear that focusing on speed will never ever get us the speed that we want. We instead need to focus on building the skill of understanding. When that skill gets better and better and better, we will understand with less information and understand earlier in the passage what the passage is trying to tell us to do. With that understanding, we can organize everything else in the passage by whether it agrees, whether it fits, whether it doesn't fit. We can predict what the passage needs to do. And with that high level of understanding, putting that work in early, taking our time, the rest of the questions that it could ask can't surprise us and they can't trick us. So we want you to focus on building that understanding skill and checking in with your process as an RC student. Reconstruct your way, reconstruct your reading, and see, where could I be a little bit better? Where could I understand a little bit sooner? And how can that understanding ultimately lead me to success in the questions? As that skill grows, we know your time is going to follow. You just can't focus on time before we've focused on building that skill. So with that, I think we've given you some tools to get a little bit better at RC. This is the second episode in our series. As you can tell, All and I could talk RC all day. So more
and
to
we
follow.
will.
We will. You can email daily@lsatdemon.com to ask us any questions about our series we're working on here, or share any experiences you have with reading comprehension, and we'll be happy to include it. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. We believe in you.